Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a stack of research on behavioral economics and personal finance to tackle, I think, one of the most frustrating paradoxes of modern life.
Which is?
Why is it that a high income so rarely translates into lasting wealth? And, maybe even more importantly, why is it that when wealth is finally achieved, it often fails to deliver that sustained happiness we all expect?
Yeah. It's the core financial dilemma that I think confuses almost everyone, no matter what their paycheck looks like. We have this assumption that if we just make enough money, the rest will kind of sort itself out.
Right.
But the behavioral science really proves that there are these powerful, almost automatic psychological forces working against both saving and contentment.
So our mission for this deep dive is to cut through that complexity. We're going to look at the mechanisms that actively sabotage our long-term goals.
And then we'll analyze the disciplined habits you need to actually beat those mechanisms.
Okay, let's start with the fundamentals, because this whole conversation, it really hinges on a crucial distinction that high earners especially seem to miss. We have to look at income versus net worth.
Yeah.
People confuse them all the time, but they measure fundamentally different things about your financial reality.
They really do. I like to think of it this way. Income is your engine's horsepower. Net worth is how far the car has actually traveled and, what it's managed to keep along the way.
I like that analogy. So let's lay out the precise definition, starting with income.
So income is the total flow of money you receive over a period. This is everything. Your salary, wages, any commissions, business profits, dividends from investments.
Even things like a tax refund or a gift.
Exactly. It's what you bring in.
Mm-hmm.
But, and this is a big bet, for anyone who is serious about tracking their financial reality, we have to focus on net income.
Right, not the exciting big gross number that we like to talk about before all the deductions come out for taxes, healthcare, retirement contributions.
Precisely. Your net income is the actual usable cash that hits your bank account. It determines your standard of living today, yes, but it's also the primary source of fuel for building wealth. You need that income to even start the process.
But the true measure of financial security, of stability, the measure of what you actually keep, that's net worth. That's the one that really matters when you're determining if someone is wealthy, regardless of what their annual salary is.
Absolutely. Net worth gives you the complete financial snapshot. It's calculated by taking your total assets. So everything you own that holds value, like cash, investments, real estate, your car, and then subtracting your tails.
Total liabilities.
Liabilities being all your debts, basically. Mortgages, car loans, credit card balances, student loans.
So if your assets exceed your liabilities, you have a positive net worth. If your debts outweigh the value of everything you own, you have a negative net worth, and it doesn't matter how much you earned last year.
That's the key. The central insight here, the one we really need to hold on to, is that income measures how fast you make money. Net worth is the measure of what you retain and grow. And so many high-income people retain almost nothing. Lifestyle creep and debt just eat it all up.
So we have this fundamental tension. The speed of your income versus your ability to retain assets. And our deep dive today is structured to explain the behavioral forces that really govern that tension.
Right.
We're going to tackle this paradox in 3 stages. First, we'll examine the overwhelming psychological damage that financial stress causes, what researchers call the scarcity mindset. Then we'll shift to the practical disciplined habits required to beat that short-term thinking and actually build lasting net worth.
And finally,
We will explore the deep psychological concept that often undermines our contentment even after all the money goals are met, the hedonic treadmill.
okay, let's get into it.
Let's start at the beginning of the problem. The state that makes disciplined saving and long-term planning feel, well, almost impossible. Financial pressure. When we're stressed about money, it doesn't just make us feel bad. It measurably warps how we value time and the future. This concept is known as temporal discounting.
And it's really important to define financial pressure precisely here. We define financial scarcity not necessarily as, objective poverty, though that's certainly part of it, but as the subjective experience.
A feeling.
The feeling that your available financial resources are fundamentally insufficient to meet your current demands. It's the feeling of having to make really difficult trade-offs with limited resources.
And the subjective experience, this feeling, it triggers what's called the scarcity mindset. Help us understand what that mindset looks like and, more importantly, what it actually does to our brains.
Well, the scarcity mindset is this automatic, highly effective psychological state that is geared toward immediate survival. putting out the financial fires that are right in front of you.
An emergency protocol.
This emergency protocol, exactly.
Yeah.
And it impacts your decision-making through two major interconnected mechanisms that just drain your cognitive resources.
Okay, what's the first mechanism?
The first is attentional focus. In the research, they often call it tunnel vision. Because your resources are scarce, your mind directs nearly all of its available cognitive energy to the immediate pressing problem.
Which is adaptive in the moment.
Very adaptive. If you only have enough cash for rent or for food, your brain focuses intensely on acquiring that rent or that food.
But this laser focus, which is so helpful in an emergency, it has to come at the expense of everything else, right?
Precisely. That's the steep price of this tunnel vision, the neglect of future consequences. A person under scarcity might focus entirely on getting immediate cash, say, through a high-interest payday loan.
Because the immediate relief of having the cash.
It just completely outweighs the enormous future cost of the interest and the fees. They disregard that future consequence because the present need is just so overwhelming.
So if the brain is focused entirely on the immediate problem, what happens to the mental machinery we need for planning?
And that's where the second mechanism, cognitive load, comes in. The rumination, the anxiety, the constant worry about money. It consumes serious mental bandwidth.
I like the analogy of trying to run complex software on a computer that's already maxed out.
It's a perfect analogy. It just slows to a crawl. And the literature confirms that these worries leave fewer mental resources available for those higher-level cognitive processes that require long-term planning and impulse control.
I remember the research specifically pinpointing a region of the brain here. Is that right?
It is, and that's where the science gets really, really interesting. Studies have shown that financial scarcity actually reduces activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
Okay, and that's the part of the brain that's responsible for what exactly?
It's the crucial area responsible for goal-directed planning, for working memory, and for impulse control. So when this area is impaired by cognitive load, the likelihood that someone will make a decision favoring short-term relief just increases dramatically.
So they'll seek immediate gains and they'll delay any payments they can.
Both. Exactly.
This diminished capacity for long-term thinking, it leads directly to the core behavioral consequence we want to analyze. Temporal discounting. Can you define this for us formally and then maybe put it in a real-world context?
Sure. Temporal discounting is the formal term for the devaluation of future outcomes relative to immediate ones. We quantify it with something called a discount rate. Essentially, a high discount rate means you're placing a much, much higher value on outcomes you get sooner today compared to outcomes you get later.
So in simple terms, if I offer you $50 today or $100 in 6 months and you take the $50 today, you're showing a high discount rate. You're discounting the value of that future $100 by more than half.
That's the classic example for games, yes. But the effect is twofold, and the second part is what is so destructive in the context of debt and scarcity. It also applies to losses.
Okay.
A high discount rate means you would prefer a delayed, larger loss over an immediate, smaller loss.
Give us a classic scarcity example of discounting losses.
Okay, think about a credit card bill that's due today. The immediate, smaller loss is paying that bill in full. But if you're experiencing severe scarcity, you might prefer to put that payment off, even if it means accepting a much larger consequence later.
Like a 30% interest rate and a $39 late fee.
Exactly. Just to avoid the immediate, smaller pain of paying today, you're willing to accept a hugely inflated future cost, simply to buy yourself some time.
This all moves beyond just theory. The causal evidence is really strong here, a lot of it coming from the Leiden University experiments using the household task paradigm. This really moved the study of scarcity out of the abstract and into a controlled, experimental simulation of financial stress.
The Leiden studies are a landmark, absolutely, because they were designed to create financial scarcity independent of whether the participant was actually poor in real life.
Right, which allowed them to isolate the effects of the mindset induced by the financial constraints.
That's the key.
So how did they create and validate this artificial scarcity?
Participants had to manage a simulated household budget over 6 rounds, with each round representing a week. They earned income by doing an effort task. I think they had to type random strings backward.
Fun.
Yeah, to pay for fixed monthly expenses based on average costs. The critical manipulation was the income they got relative to those expenses. Based on their assigned condition, they ended up in one of 3 states: debt, where income was lower than expenses, a neutral control condition, where income equaled expenses, or a savings condition, where income was higher.
And they had to make sure this actually worked, that it created the feeling of scarcity, regardless of what the participants' real-life bank account looked like.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they ran a pilot study and validated the manipulation using an established measure called the PIFS scale.
Wait, you mentioned PIFS. That sounds a bit technical. Let's make sure we define that.
Oh, my apologies, yes. PIFS stands for Prior Experience Financial Scarcity. It's basically a scale that assesses a person's financial distress and resource constraints in their actual day-to-day life outside of the lab.
Got it.
And the pilot study was so critical because it confirmed that the experimental manipulation, so being put in the debt condition, it successfully induced a significantly higher subjective experience of financial scarcity, of stress, of worry, and lack of control, even among people who scored low on the PIFS scale.
So even if you were wealthy in real life, being put in debt in the simulation made you feel the scarcity.
It worked. The lab-induced debt successfully simulated the feeling of scarcity, independent of their usual wealth level.
That is a really powerful tool for isolating the variable. So what did the actual discounting results show? Let's start with gains.
The results for gains were, well, they were quite dramatic and quantifiable. Financial scarcity significantly increased the discounting of future gains. Participants in that debt condition were asked how much they would need to be paid in the future, say in 1 year, to give up an immediate smaller gain.
And they wanted a huge premium to wait.
Immense. They devalued future outcomes with an annualized interest rate premium of between 37% and 41%.
Let's just stop there for a second and put that into perspective for anyone listening. If you are operating under scarcity, you're essentially telling yourself that unless someone pays you a premium equivalent to 37% to 41% annual interest, it's just not worth waiting even a year.
Right.
I mean, that's why payday loans, with their triple-digit interest rates, are structurally attractive to someone in scarcity because their own internal discount rate is already astronomical.
That is precisely the implication. And you compare that shocking figure to the participants who had savings. They only discounted future outcomes with a yearly interest rate of 28%.
So the debt condition made people almost 10 to 13 percentage points more impatient, financially speaking.
It did. And this is the psychological mechanism that forces you to choose the $50 now over the $100 later, even if you intellectually know the $100 is better.
And what about the new finding, the one about losses?
For losses, the effect was also very clear. The absolute discount rate was lower, which you'd expect. People are generally less willing to postpone losses than gains. But the difference between the groups was enormous. The debt participants discounted future losses with an 18% yearly interest rate.
18% to delay a loss. Wow.
While those with savings discounted losses with only a 3% yearly interest rate.
3%.
It's a huge gap. And it supports the idea that financial scarcity causes you to focus heavily on avoiding that immediate loss, the feeling of making the payment, even if the long-term delayed cost, that 18% premium, is significantly greater. This is the scientific evidence for why people carry chronic credit card balances and delay bill payments. It's the debt trap, quantified.
Okay, so we've established that scarcity impairs long-term decision-making, but the research team asked a really crucial follow-up question in later experiments. Is this high discount rate caused purely by a psychological mindset, a temporary stress, or is it more of an adaptive response to an actual felt resource constraint?
And this is where experiments 3, 4, and 5 provided so much nuance. In those studies, they manipulated the scarcity mindset, but they made sure participants either ended the task with savings or received some kind of closing scenario that eliminated the financial threat.
So they took the threat away at the end.
They did, and what they discovered was profound. The increased discounting did not occur if the constraint was lifted or resolved.
So if the participants knew they would be okay in the end, even if they were stressed during the task, that high discount rate just disappeared.
It did. The elevated discounting only manifested when resources were currently lacking. So they were in debt or, and this is crucial, when participants anticipated future debts. In experiment 5, for example, participants started with a positive balance, but they accumulated losses every round, suggesting their money would run out soon. They showed stronger discounting than the steady savers, even though their current bank balance at that moment was identical to the savers.
That is the pivotal takeaway for anyone listening. The extreme short-term focus, that high discount rate, it's not just a result of general fleeting stress. It's an adaptive, or you could even argue a rational response to a current or anticipated future shortage of financial resources.
The need has to feel seriously threatened for the effect to appear. Once that financial threat is resolved, the discount rates just revert back to baseline.
Which means financial stress doesn't just make you uncomfortable, it creates a literal economic tax on your decision-making.
You're paying a 10 to 13 percentage point premium to the universe to solve today's problems. And that makes it virtually impossible to build wealth until that initial threat of scarcity is finally removed.
That was a powerful explanation of the problem. So if the scarcity mindset forces us into these short-term, high-discount decisions, then escaping that trap and building lasting wealth must require the exact opposite, adopting disciplined, long-term habits that defeat short-termism. We can now transition from the psychological problem to the practical behavioral solutions. We noted earlier that a high income doesn't guarantee a high net worth. Let's dive deeper into the traps that high earners fall into, even when they should, theoretically, be building wealth easily.
I think the biggest behavioral challenge for high earners is managing those rising expectations. They operate under this flawed assumption that the income itself is the solution, and they neglect the crucial step of conversion, converting that cash flow into retained assets.
The first and probably the most insidious trap is the lifestyle trap, or lifestyle creep.
Oh, it's a devastating cycle. It gets fueled by social signaling and hedonic adaptation, which we'll get to in the next section. As your earnings increase, you almost immediately upgrade your spending habits.
A bigger house, a nicer car.
A house that requires a massive mortgage and maintenance costs. Leasing a luxury car. Taking lavish, frequent holidays. You're living rich, making your high income look impressive, but you're just continuously running faster to stay in the same place financially. You're living paycheck to paycheck, just at a much higher level of consumption.
So their liabilities are keeping perfect pace with their assets, which prevents them from ever getting real net worth growth.
Exactly. And this high consumption lifestyle, it requires a massive, continuous inflow of cash. And that leads directly to the second trap, dependency on active income.
Meaning when every dollar is allocated to maintaining that lifestyle, the earner becomes totally reliant on their high salary or their active business.
It's a fundamentally unstable position, even if you're a doctor or a successful lawyer.
It seems so risky.
It is high risk. Jobs aren't guaranteed, markets shift, economic downturns happen. If all your financial security comes from active income, so money you earn when you are physically working, you are one job loss, one health crisis, one market shift away from severe instability.
Whereas true wealth is built on assets that generate income passively.
Right, reducing that dependency on your labor.
Then there's the psychological problem of just handling the excess cash that a high income generates, which leads to the risk of inaction.
This one usually manifests in two common extremes, and both are rooted in fear and a lack of planning. On one side, you have the hoarder.
Okay.
They accumulate large amounts of cash, often in low-interest savings or checking accounts. And while they feel safe, inflation is just quietly eroding their purchasing power over time. They're sacrificing growth for a feeling of safety.
And the other extreme.
The gambler. Lacking a structured plan, they treat wealth building like a quick lottery win. They make unstructured, high-risk, speculative investments, just hoping for a quick hit rather than committing to the patient, disciplined strategy you need for long-term compounding. Both approaches fail because they lack an intentional framework.
And finally, a trap specific to the truly high earners. Poor tax and asset protection planning. This is where I assume professional expertise becomes non-negotiable.
It really does. As your income skyrockets, so does your marginal tax rate. Without proactively using tax-efficient structures, like specialized retirement accounts, trusts, or business entities, a significant portion of your hard-earned income is just unnecessarily lost to taxes.
And you become a target.
You become a target. A high net worth means you need to think about asset protection. Without the right structures in place, a single lawsuit, a business failure, or an unforeseen medical event can wipe out years of accumulation. Building net worth requires defending it with a proactive plan that a lower earner just doesn't need to worry about in the same way.
Okay, so if those are the traps that feed the short-term mind, let's pivot to the deliberate habits that self-made millionaires use to prioritize long-term net worth growth. How do they structurally defeat that scarcity impulse?
They exhibit this relentless financial discipline, and they prioritize accumulation over instant consumption. The foundational habit, the one that has to be non-negotiable, is prioritizing saving and investing.
And the research is pretty clear on the numbers here.
Oh, it's crystal clear. A 2023 Fidelity survey found that over 80% of self-made millionaires save at least 20% of their income annually.
20%. That is a massive Psychological and financial commitment, especially when you're just starting out. Why is that specific number, or at least that level of dedication, so critical?
Because it creates an immediate structural barrier against lifestyle creep. If you wait to save what is left after spending, you will inevitably spend it all. We know this, especially with the scarcity mindset pushing you toward immediate gratification.
So you have to pay yourself first?
You have to. By automating 20% or more to investment vehicles, you're adopting the core philosophy that's often attributed to Warren Buffett. Do not save what is left after spending, but spend what is left after saving. It reframes savings from a consequence of wealth to a prerequisite for it.
And this leads directly into the second crucial habit, which I think clashes with our cultural expectations of what wealth looks like: living below means.
This is the quiet competence of true wealth. The core finding from studies like The Millionaire Next Door is that most millionaires do not drive luxury vehicles or live in ostentatious homes. They're often highly frugal
Why?
because their identity is built around asset accumulation, not status signaling. They live in modest homes and drive average cars because their focus is entirely on increasing assets, things that generate income, like index funds, stocks, rental properties, and minimizing liabilities, things that drain your cash flow, like luxury car payments and expensive debts.
So it redefines what it means to be wealthy. It's not about how rich you look, it's about how much you own.
Exactly. The person living below their means is redirecting cash flow from depreciating consumption to appreciating investment. They are structurally avoiding the lifestyle trap.
Now let's talk about budgeting. We need to frame this not as a restrictive chore, but as a proactive tool that defeats mindless spending.
That is the discipline of budgeting. The numbers confirm its importance. A 2024 CNBC report found that 76% of millionaires use some form of budgeting. They don't budget because they're poor. They budget because it ensures every dollar has a purpose and supports their long-term accumulation goal.
And specifically, the recommendation is often zero-based budgeting. Why is that technique so effective from a behavioral standpoint?
Well, zero-based budgeting assigns every single dollar of your net income a specific job savings, rent, food, entertainment, until the total income minus the expenses equals zero.
And psychologically.
Psychologically, this defeats what we might call the phantom dollar phenomenon. If you see $2,000 sitting in your checking account, your brain just sees that as available spending money. Zero-based budgeting ensures that, say, $500 of that is earmarked for next month's property tax, $1,000 is going to an investment, and only $500 is left for discretionary fun. It makes spending intentional rather than incidental.
So it's about forcing clarity and intention onto a resource that the scarcity mindset just naturally wants to spend immediately.
Precisely. Next, we have to look at the continuous cognitive investment that's required. Continuous learning.
Why is financial literacy so strongly correlated with wealth accumulation? I mean, isn't having a good CPA enough?
It's because markets, tax laws, opportunities, they're constantly evolving. True self-made millionaires treat financial literacy as a non-negotiable professional skill. They invest heavily in knowledge.
Reading foundational texts.
Reading texts like The Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham, understanding complex tax codes, grasping principles like margin of safety for prudent, non-speculative investing. They didn't just rely on others. They are deeply involved in the strategic deployment and defense of their assets. They're proactive, not passive learners.
And this active learning, it naturally helps them transition to the next habit, which is diversifying income streams. If you know the landscape, you know where to build secondary sources of revenue.
The goal here is to build redundancy and resilience. We already established that relying solely on active income is risky. Millionaires seek to build income that works even when they're sleeping passive cash flows.
Like dividend stocks or...
Dividend stocks, income-producing rental properties, royalties, side businesses that can operate autonomously. All of it.
This seems to clash a little bit with the prudent, disciplined approach of someone like Graham. If we look at, say, Grant Cardone, who emphasizes the 10x rule and very aggressive capital deployment, how does that entrepreneurial risk-taking align with the quiet accumulation we see in The Millionaire Next Door?
That's a great point of tension. The alignment really occurs in the distinction between speculation and calculated risk that's backed by knowledge. Graham's principles are about protecting your capital first. Cardone's philosophy is about leveraging effort and scaling operations, creating multiple cash flows that are still active businesses but are designed to run independently of the founder's direct labor.
So both reduce that single point of failure.
Exactly. Both models defeat dependency, but one is generally more about protecting capital, that's Graham, and the other is about aggressively scaling capital, Cardone. The key is the knowledge and the discipline behind the deployment.
Finally, we revisit the concept of debt avoidance, which is really the mirror image of the scarcity trap we analyzed earlier.
Debt avoidance and management is absolutely critical. Self-made millionaires view high-interest consumer debt credit cards, personal loans used for consumption, as toxic. They pay off their credit card balances monthly.
And they only use loans strategically.
Only. When the expected return from the asset being acquired, say a cash-flowing rental unit or a business expansion, significantly outweighs the cost of borrowing. Debt is a tool for strategic acquisition, not a mechanism for funding consumption.
So to summarize this section, the pathway to net worth growth involves a ruthless focus on long-term assets, disciplined automation, intentional budgeting to defeat the phantom dollar, continuous learning to inform your strategy, and a deliberate structural separation between your income and your consumption.
And we should probably acknowledge one unexpected habit that many successful accumulators adopt: generosity. Philanthropy reinforces a mindset of abundance. It signals to your brain that resources are not scarce, which directly counteracts the very mechanism we discussed in Section 1.
That's a great point.
It helps you establish a balanced, non-hoarding relationship with money. And that takes us directly to the final and perhaps the most challenging paradox of all.
So if we successfully conquer scarcity, adopt all these millionaire habits, and build a substantial net worth, we should theoretically be permanently content.
You'd think so.
Yet we know this often isn't the case. People who achieve all their financial goals often still feel this persistent need to chase the next objective, the next million, the next status symbol. Why isn't happiness permanent? This is where we introduce the hedonic treadmill.
The hedonic treadmill, or hedonic adaptation, is arguably the most powerful psychological force undermining financial fulfillment. It is the conjecture, formalized by Brickman and Campbell back in 1971, that humans quickly return to a relatively stable baseline level of happiness, their happiness set point, despite major positive or negative life changes.
That's the devastating analogy, isn't it? You're running so fast on this treadmill, making massive progress financially, but your expectations and your desires are rising just as quickly, so you stay in the same place in terms of your subjective well-being.
The initial burst of joy from a major achievement, a huge raise, paying off a mortgage, buying a luxury item, it's intense, but it's fleeting. We habituate to the new elevated state, and that state quickly becomes our new neutral baseline.
You get a $50,000 raise, you're happier for a few months.
And then your definition of normal just shifts. You start looking at things you couldn't afford before the raise, and the whole cycle just continues.
So what's driving this? Let's talk about the psychological and maybe the neurochemical mechanisms.
Well, on a cognitive level, adaptation is driven by constantly shifting comparative standards. We compare our current state to our immediate past state, and we also compare it to the perceived state of our social peers. Once we habituate to a new standard of living, that standard just becomes the new 0 point, forcing us to seek out new stimuli to even register as positive again.
And the brain itself might be wired to prevent sustained euphoria.
That's the neurochemical theory, yeah. It's theorized that the brain actively works to desensitize overstimulated hedonic pathways. I mean, if we were constantly euphoric, we would never seek improvement or change. This adaptation process, while it's frustrating, is biologically necessary. It prevents complacency, it allows us to cope with unchangeable negative circumstances, but it also ensures the excitement of a new luxury car is inherently temporary.
The classic empirical support for this theory came from that 1978 comparison study. Let's walk through those findings because they are so compelling and honestly a little counterintuitive.
That study compared the reported happiness levels of 22 recent lottery winners and 29 recent accident victims who were now paraplegics or quadriplegics, and they compared them against a control group. The findings were used for decades to support the rigidity of this set point idea.
So what happened to the lottery winners?
Well, after the initial euphoria, the lottery winners reported being similarly happy before and after the event. And significantly, they expected to return to their baseline levels of happiness within a relatively short period. The massive positive shock was just neutralized by adaptation. They got used to their new level of wealth.
And for the accident victims?
The paraplegics did report a lower level of current happiness than the control group, which is understandable. But the crucial finding was their expected future happiness. They projected that they would return to levels similar to the control group within a couple of years.
So even with that severe trauma, the brain's adaptive mechanism was at work.
It was. It was shifting their comparison points and helping them cope and reestablish a baseline.
However, more recent longitudinal research has provided a critical revision to this idea that happiness set point might be more malleable, a soft baseline, than Brickman and Campbell originally proposed.
And this revision is vital for our sense of optimism, I think. While genetics certainly play a huge role, studies suggest up to 50% of our happiness is genetically determined. The longitudinal work by Fujita and Diener found that the set point is not entirely fixed.
How so?
They tracked thousands of people over many years and found that about 25% of the population experienced substantial long-term shifts in their life satisfaction over time. So it's not a fixed thermostat, it's more of a range that can be moved.
So if the set point can shift, what kinds of events are powerful enough to cause a lasting, non-adapted shift?
Interestingly, the events that cause lasting shifts are generally negative, severe, and persistent. It suggests that adaptation is highly effective at neutralizing positive financial shocks, but less successful at overcoming chronic trauma.
Like what?
Longitudinal data shows that severe, long-term disability, divorce, the death of a spouse, and prolonged unemployment, especially for men, have been shown to cause changes in long-term subjective well-being that adaptation really struggles to fully neutralize. For example, a severe long-term disability seems to have an impact almost twice as large as the negative personality trait of neuroticism.
That reinforces the idea that adaptation works against the high-income earner seeking contentment, but struggles to overcome these persistent existential threats. So the practical question then is, how do we actively sustain well-being and potentially raise that soft baseline? How do we step off the treadmill?
We have to intentionally shift our focus away from external accumulation and status, the things the treadmill runs on, and toward internal factors. Research consistently shows that the most significant factors affecting subjective well-being are things we have direct control over, or at least strong influence on.
Right.
An internal locus of control, the belief that you control your own destiny and outcomes and personality traits like low neuroticism.
This suggests that the goals we set for ourselves are critical in determining whether adaptation neutralizes our efforts or solidifies them.
Absolutely. Researchers categorize goals into two types that directly influence long-term happiness. The first are non-zero-sum goals.
Okay, what are those?
These are goals that enrich one's relationships and society as a whole, so family-oriented goals, altruistic activities, spiritual development, deep community involvement. Achieving these significantly increases subjective well-being because the value you get is internal and relative only to yourself, not compared to your peers.
And then there are the goals that really drove sections 1 and 2 of our conversation, financial success and status.
These are the zero-sum goals. Goals focused specifically on career success, wealth accumulation, social status. They're defined as zero-sum because they're often measured relative to others.
Am I richer than my neighbor? Did I get the promotion my colleague wanted?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And ironically, the pursuit of these goals was found to have a small but statistically significant negative impact on overall subjective well-being.
And that is the ultimate financial paradox we started with. The rigorous discipline and intense focus you need to build net worth career drive, wealth obsession, status seeking are the very goals that the hedonic treadmill thrives on and which actively contribute to slightly lower long-term happiness.
It creates this cognitive dissonance. You need the discipline of Section 2 to escape the threat of Section 1. But the pursuit of those Section 2 goals, if they remain extrinsic and comparison-driven, actively lowers your set point in Section 3.
So the solution isn't to give up the wealth.
No, it's to decouple the wealth from the source of happiness.
And what's the practical application for that, based on the research?
It involves active engagement in non-zero-sum activities. The literature strongly suggests that acts of kindness and sustained altruistic activities, giving your time, your money, your effort to others, promote long-term well-being and help nudge that hedonic set point upward. By prioritizing goals that benefit others, you shift your mental energy away from the competition and the external measures that adaptation so quickly neutralizes.
This deep dive has traveled from the urgency of financial stress all the way to the contentment of psychological freedom. Let's try to synthesize the 3 key components we discussed today.
Okay, first, we established that the immediate psychological threat of financial scarcity is highly destructive. It forces short-term, high-discount decisions. When your financial resources are currently or anticipated to be lacking, your brain just tunnels.
And causes you to agree to these absurd premiums, upwards of 40% annual interest on games, just for immediate relief.
And that mechanism traps people in a cycle of debt and instability.
Second, we learned that building net worth requires defeating the short-term impulse through intentional long-term discipline. The key habits include automating your savings at least 20% before any consumption happens.
Using zero-based budgeting for intentional spending, relentlessly focusing on acquiring assets over liabilities, and continuously learning to manage those assets efficiently.
And third, we found that even mastering wealth creation doesn't guarantee permanent happiness because of the hedonic treadmill.
Right. Contentment is undermined as our desires and expectations just rise right along with our income. And sustaining that well-being requires a deliberate shift of focus away from those extrinsic zero-sum financial goals and toward internal non-zero-sum goals like altruism and meaningful relationships, which the mind is much slower to adapt to.
For the listener who is currently feeling that pressure of scarcity and is ready to establish the long-term habits we talked about in Section 2, what are the 3 most immediate actionable steps they should commit to today?
Step 1, immediately commit to tracking your net worth, not just your income. Know your assets and your liabilities. You can't manage what you don't measure.
Okay.
Step 2, implement a zero-based budget. This forces intentionality and it defeats that phantom dollar phenomena, making sure every dollar is assigned a job that aligns with your long-term goals.
And step 3,
Automate the savings first philosophy. Set up an automatic transfer for a minimum of 20% of your net income to an investment account before you do any discretionary spending. If you pay your future self first, the rest of your spending just naturally falls into place.
that is a powerful and actionable framework for building a stable financial foundation. Now let's leave you with the provocative final thought we touched on earlier, tying all 3 sections together. We learned that the destructive discounting effect of scarcity just disappears the moment the financial constraint is lifted.
Right.
And we also learned that sustained happiness requires a shift toward non-financial, non-zero-sum goals.
So if the psychological cost of scarcity is so high and the psychological reward of endless accumulation is so low, should achieving a sufficient but modest net worth, what we define as financial security, the point where scarcity is permanently lifted, should that be viewed as the true ultimate financial goal?
It's an interesting question.
Perhaps the real purpose of money is simply to buy the mental freedom you need to pivot your limited cognitive energy entirely toward non-zero-sum activities that actually feed long-term sustained happiness rather than spending a lifetime just chasing the treadmill.
Food for thought. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.